Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The second I stepped into my mother's house and didn't hear Liam's voice, I knew something was wrong. A feeling so immediate and so sharp that it made my stomach twist with unease before I had even taken another step inside. The house was too quiet, too still, too empty for a place that was supposed to have a 4-year-old running around. A place where I had expected to find his laughter echoing through the rooms, his little shoes by the door. His favorite stuffed dinosaur tossed onto the couch where he always left it. Instead, there was nothing, no sign that he had been here at all, no toys scattered across the floor, no half-finished juice box on the counter, nothing but the suffocating silence of a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. My heartbeat quickened, pounding in my ears as I set my purse down with shaking hands, my voice coming out tighter than I intended when I called out into the empty space. "Mom? Where's Liam?" I asked, forcing myself to sound calm, forcing myself to believe that there was a reasonable explanation, forcing myself not to panic just yet. Diane appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, looking as composed as ever, as if nothing at all was out of place, as if I wasn't standing there with my pulse racing, as if she didn't even register the sharp edge of anxiety in my voice. She smiled in that absent-minded way of hers, like she had been expecting me but hadn't thought much about the details. Like my presence was just another minor inconvenience in her day rather than the moment I had been looking forward to since I left for my job interview. "Oh, Emily needed me to watch the twins, so I had to run over there for a bit," she said casually, her tone breezy, dismissive, like she was commenting on the weather rather than the fact that my son was nowhere to be seen. I blinked, my brain struggling to process what she had just said, my body suddenly stiff with a tension that made my hands clench into fists at my sides. "What?" I said, the word barely above a whisper, my voice laced with disbelief, a horrible, creeping realization settling into my chest like ice. "What do you mean you ran over there? Where's Liam?" She waved a hand, as if swatting away my concern like it was nothing more than an overreaction, as if I was being dramatic for even questioning her, as if I wasn't standing there on the verge of losing my mind. "Oh, relax, Sarah, he's fine," she said, rolling her eyes slightly, the way she always did when she thought I was being too sensitive, too emotional, too difficult to deal with. "I left him with Mrs. Harper next door. She's raised 3 kids, she knows what she's doing, and besides, I figured you wouldn't mind. Emily really needed me." The words hit me like a slap, like a punch to the gut, knocking the air out of my lungs so fast that for a moment, all I could do was stare at her, my mind struggling to wrap itself around what I had just heard. She had left my son with a neighbor I barely knew, handed him off like a package, made a split-second decision that wasn't hers to make, all because Emily had needed her, because Emily's needs had once again come before mine, because Emily, as always, had been the priority. I felt my chest tighten, felt my nails dig into the palms of my hands as I forced myself to stay calm, forced myself not to scream, not to let my rage boil over into something uncontrollable, not to break down right there in front of her. I started, my voice cracking slightly before I swallowed hard, pushing back the fury that threatened to spill out of me in a way that couldn't be undone. "You left my son with a stranger because Emily needed you?" Diane let out a sigh, exasperated, like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was making a scene over something that didn't matter, like I wasn't standing there shaking with the sheer force of my anger. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Sarah," she said, shaking her head, waving me off again like I was a child throwing a tantrum rather than a mother who had just found out her son had been abandoned. "You know Mrs. Harper, she's a perfectly nice woman. Liam was fine, I checked in, everything was fine. You always act like the world is ending over the smallest things. The smallest things. My son being left with a stranger without my knowledge, my son being tossed aside like an afterthought because Emily had called and needed something, my son being treated as if he were less important than my sister's never-ending chaos. This was a small thing to her. Something inside me snapped, something deep and buried that I had been holding onto for years, something that had been growing with every slight, every dismissal, every moment where I had been forced to accept that I would never come first. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my purse, my voice steel-edged as I forced the words through clenched teeth. Where exactly does Mrs. Harper live? Diane barely reacted, barely seemed to care, barely even looked at me as she rattled off the house number, already turning back to her kitchen as if this conversation was over, as if I was supposed to walk out that door and come back later, smiling and pretending that none of this had happened. But this time, there would be no pretending, no brushing it under the rug, no forgiving and moving on, no more swallowing my anger just to keep the peace. I turned on my heel and walked out of the house without another word, my heartbeat thundering in my ears, my breath coming short and fast as I practically ran down the street toward the house Diane had mentioned, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. With all the ways this could have gone wrong, with the gut-wrenching realization that if something had happened, I wouldn't have even known because my own mother hadn't thought I was important enough to call. I reached Mrs. Harper's door and knocked so hard my knuckles ached, my stomach twisting with fear, my entire body trembling with the weight of what had just happened, with the understanding that something had changed, that something had broken, that I would never see my mother the same way again. How could my own mother do this to me? How could she treat my child like an inconvenience, like an afterthought, like something that could be pushed aside without a second thought? And worse, if she had done it once, who was to say she wouldn't do it again? The second I saw Liam standing in the doorway of the neighbor's house, his small face lighting up the moment he recognized me, I felt a rush of relief so overwhelming that my knees nearly buckled beneath me, my heart pounding in my chest as I hurried forward, scooping him up into my arms as though I could shield him from everything that had already happened. His little arms wrapped tightly around my neck, his warmth seeping into my skin, his voice chirping happily in my ear, completely unaware of the way my hands trembled as I held him, of the way my breath hitched as I pressed my face into his soft curls, of the way my entire world had almost shattered in the span of a single afternoon. I wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to march back to my mother's house and throw every ounce of my fury in her face, wanted to make her feel even a fraction of the panic that had nearly consumed me the moment I realized Liam was gone. But standing there, feeling my son's tiny heartbeat against my chest, I knew that none of that would change what had already happened, knew that no amount of anger or confrontation would undo the choices my mother had made, knew that this moment, this terrifying, gut-wrenching moment, was just another in a long line of betrayals that had started long before Liam was even born. As I thanked the neighbor through gritted teeth, forcing myself to nod politely as she assured me that Liam had been such a sweetheart and that everything was perfectly fine, I felt something dark and familiar begin to creep in. Something that had been buried so deep inside me for so many years that I had almost forgotten it was there. It wasn't just anger, wasn't just hurt, wasn't even just the disbelief of knowing that my own mother had abandoned my child as if he were an afterthought. It was something worse, something colder. Something that had been building inside me for as long as I could remember. Because this wasn't just about today, wasn't just about this one moment, wasn't just about what had happened this afternoon when I walked into my mother's house expecting to see my son and instead found an empty living room and a hollow excuse. This was about years, about decades, about a lifetime of being second place, about a lifetime of watching my mother choose someone else over me, about a lifetime of realizing, over and over again, that I would never come first. As I carried Liam back to my car, his tiny fingers playing absent-mindedly with the zipper on my jacket, I felt the weight of old memories pressing down on me, memories I had spent so much time trying to push away, trying to ignore, trying to pretend didn't still sting after all these years. I remembered birthdays where Emily got the bigger present, the shinier wrapping paper, the one thing I had secretly hoped for but was always given to her instead, my mother's reasoning always the same, that Emily was younger, that Emily needed more, that I should be the understanding one. I remembered Christmas mornings when my sister's stocking was overflowing with gifts while mine was half full, my mother brushing it off with a distracted laugh, saying she must have miscounted but never bothering to fix it. I remembered school plays where Emily was showered with flowers and praise while I barely got a glance, vacations where my opinions didn't matter, dinners where my voice wasn't heard, arguments where I was always the one expected to back down, to be the bigger person, to let it go for the sake of keeping the peace. And then, as I buckled Liam into his car seat, watching his little fingers fumble with the strap, another memory surfaced, one that I hadn't thought about in years, one that had settled somewhere deep in my chest, forgotten but never truly gone. I had been 10 years old, standing in the hallway outside my parents' bedroom, my small hands clenched into fists at my sides, tears stinging my eyes as I listened to my mother soothe Emily after yet another meltdown, another tantrum. Another dramatic episode that had pulled all attention away from whatever I had been doing, whatever had mattered to me at the time. I had tried so hard to stay quiet, to wait patiently, to hope that maybe, just maybe, my mother would come to me next, would realize that I had been waiting too, that I had needs too, that I was hurting too. But she never did. She had walked right past me, barely sparing me a glance, too focused on calming Emily down, too preoccupied with making sure my sister felt loved, too indifferent to notice the way my heart had cracked just a little bit more that day. And now, standing here with my son, feeling the weight of those memories pressing down on me, I realized something I had never been able to admit before. This wasn't about love, wasn't about fairness, wasn't even about Emily at all. This was about my mother and the choices she had made, about the way she had spent my entire life proving, again and again, that I was never going to be enough for her, that I was never going to be her priority, that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I achieved, I would always come second. But not anymore. As I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, I made a promise to myself, a vow so clear and so final that it sent a shiver down my spine. I would not let Liam grow up feeling the way I had felt, would not let him experience the kind of quiet, crushing rejection that had shaped my childhood, would not let him spend years wondering why he wasn't enough for the people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. I would not allow him to be second to anyone, would not allow him to be discarded the way I had been, would not let history repeat itself under any circumstances. Because my mother had made her choice, she had chosen Emily, again and again, had chosen to prioritize my sister's needs over my own, had chosen to abandon my son without a second thought, had chosen, in that moment, to prove to me once and for all that I could not trust her. And now, it was my turn to make a choice, my turn to decide what came next, my turn to take control of the narrative she had written for me all these years. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and pulled out of the driveway, my mind already made up, my heart already set, my path already clear. She had made her choice. And now, so would I. By the time I pulled into my mother's driveway, my entire body was shaking, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, my pulse hammering in my ears like a warning that this moment was about to change everything. I had spent the entire drive replaying the last few hours in my head, letting the anger settle, letting the betrayal harden into something colder, something sharper, something that no amount of forced apologies or dismissive explanations could erase. My mother had abandoned my son, had handed him off to a stranger without a second thought, had made a decision so reckless, so thoughtless, so deeply unforgivable that I still couldn't wrap my mind around how easily she had done it, how little she had cared, how utterly casual she had been when she told me, as if she had done nothing wrong. But this time, I wasn't going to let her brush it aside, wasn't going to let her manipulate the conversation, wasn't going to let her make me feel like I was the unreasonable one for expecting the bare minimum of respect and responsibility. This time, she was going to hear me. I stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind me with more force than necessary, my breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts as I marched up the walkway, my fists clenched so tightly at my sides that my nails dug into my palms. I barely knocked before pushing the door open, my heart pounding with the kind of rage I had spent years swallowing down, the kind of fury that had been simmering beneath the surface for longer than I cared to admit. My mother stood in the kitchen, completely unbothered, humming to herself as she wiped down the counter, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just betrayed me in a way that could never be undone, as if she hadn't made it clearer than ever that I would never, ever come first. She turned at the sound of the door, her face lighting up in something that almost resembled amusement, her head tilting slightly as she took in my expression, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum over something minor, as if she already had a dozen patronizing responses lined up and ready to go. "Oh, Sarah, you look exhausted," she said, her tone breezy, dismissive, the way it always was when she wanted to make me feel like I was overreacting, like my emotions were a burden, like my feelings were something to be managed rather than understood. "I take it you found Liam just fine?" Something inside me snapped so suddenly, so violently, that I almost had to steady myself against the counter, my vision blurring for a split second as the sheer weight of her indifference crashed over me like a wave, drowning out whatever self-control I had left. "Are you kidding me?" I spat, my voice shaking, my chest heaving, my entire body vibrating with the effort it took not to scream. "That's what you have to say? You left my son with a stranger, and all you can ask is if I found him just fine." She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes in that way that made my skin crawl, shaking her head like she couldn't believe I was making such a big deal out of something so trivial, like this entire conversation was a waste of her time. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous," she said, tossing the dish towel onto the counter, folding her arms across her chest like she was the one being inconvenienced. "Liam was perfectly fine. Mrs. Harper is a nice woman, she's raised 3 kids, and she was more than happy to watch him for a little while. I don't understand why you're acting like I left him on the side of the road." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking my head in disbelief, my hands still trembling at my sides, my breath still coming too fast, too shallow, too uneven. "You did leave him," I snapped, my voice cold, steady, unwavering in a way that made her expression shift slightly, just enough for me to notice. "You left him with someone I don't know, without asking me, without telling me, without even thinking about how dangerous that was. What if something had happened? What if he had been scared? What if I had come home and had no idea where my own child was?" She exhaled heavily, shaking her head again, like she was tired of this conversation, like she had already decided I was being dramatic, like she was waiting for me to wear myself out so she could go back to whatever she was doing before I walked in. And then, as if she hadn't already done enough, as if she hadn't already destroyed the last shred of trust one had left in her, she muttered something that sent a fresh wave of rage crashing through me, something so cruel, so dismissive, so gut-wrenchingly familiar that it nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. "Emily really needed me," she sighed, rubbing her temples like this was all just too much for her to deal with. "I knew you'd understand." The words rang in my ears, a haunting echo of every moment in my life where I had been pushed aside, every holiday where Emily's plans had mattered more, every time I had been expected to forgive, to adjust, to compromise, to accept that my needs would always come second to hers. And in that instant, I knew, she didn't think she had done anything wrong. She didn't see a problem. She would do it again in a heartbeat, without hesitation, without regret, without a single ounce of guilt. I took a slow, measured breath, willing myself to stay calm, forcing myself to push past the immediate urge to scream, to cry, to demand that she finally see me for once in her life. But I knew better now. I knew she never would. And more than that, I knew I didn't need her to. "You will never see my son again," I said, my voice quiet but laced with steel, with finality, with the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. "I don't trust you. I will never trust you again." Diane's face faltered, just slightly, just for a second, but she recovered quickly, plastering on that same detached, unbothered expression she had always used to make me feel like I was the problem, like I was the one being unfair. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," she scoffed, shaking her head, reaching for the dish towel like she was done with this conversation, like she had already moved on. "You'll calm down and we'll talk later." I took a step back, shaking my head, a small, bitter smile tugging at the corner of my lips as I finally let go of the last piece of me that had still been holding on. No, I said simply, turning toward the door, my heart pounding with something that felt dangerously close to freedom. We won't. And for the first time in my life, I walked away. And I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I felt something shift inside me, something cold and certain, something final in a way that left no room for second guessing, no space for guilt, no possibility of undoing what had already been set in motion. As I walked away from my mother's house, my footsteps steady, my breathing even, my mind no longer clouded with the familiar desperation of trying to make her understand, I realized that I was done waiting for her to change. Done hoping that one day she would wake up and see me the way I had always wanted to be seen. She had made her choice the moment she dismissed my anger like it was nothing more than an inconvenience, the moment she rolled her eyes and told me I would calm down, the moment she proved, yet again, that I was not worth the effort, that I was not someone she would ever fight to keep. And now I was going to make a choice of my own, one that she would never see coming, one that would finally make it clear that I was not hers to ignore anymore. That night, after I put Liam to bed, after I sat with him until his little breaths evened out, after I ran my fingers through his curls and promised myself that he would never feel this kind of pain, I made my first move. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my recent calls, and deleted every missed call from my mother without listening to a single voicemail, every text message left unread, every weak attempt at justification discarded as if they had never existed at all. I blocked her number, blocked her on social media, erased every avenue she had to reach me because I knew exactly how this would play out. I had seen it before, had lived through it time and time again, had watched her cycle through the same tired routine every time she realized she had pushed me too far. First, she would ignore it, pretending she wasn't affected, pretending she didn't care, pretending that my silence was just another phase, just another overreaction. Then, when that didn't work, she would send the guilt-ridden messages, the passive-aggressive texts, the casual attempts at conversation that were nothing more than bait, waiting for me to take the hook, waiting for me to come crawling back like I always had before. And when that failed, when she saw that I was serious, that I was actually willing to leave, she would panic. And she did. It took less than a week for the messages to start coming in through mutual acquaintances, through distant relatives who had never once checked in on me before, but were suddenly concerned about my well-being, through old family friends who sent me hesitant texts, saying they had heard things and just wanted to make sure everything was okay. My mother was spreading the story in her usual way, twisting the narrative so that she was the victim, so that I was the cruel, ungrateful daughter who had turned her back on family, who had overreacted to something small, who had cut ties for no reason other than my own stubbornness. It was a game I had seen her play before, a strategy she had perfected over the years, and for the first time I didn't care. I didn't explain myself. I didn't defend myself. I didn't waste my energy trying to correct the lies, trying to convince people who had never been on my side in the first place. Instead, I focused on the people who mattered, the people who had stood by me even when it had cost them, the people who had never made me feel like I was disposable. I leaned on them in ways I never had before, letting them pull me further from the wreckage of my past, letting myself believe that I didn't have to hold on to the family I was born into just because I had always been told that was the way it had to be. And as the weeks passed, as I started to feel lighter, started to feel something dangerously close to peace, I realized that cutting her out wasn't enough, that blocking her calls and ignoring her messages wasn't the final step. Because even though I had shut her out, even though I had drawn a line she couldn't cross, I knew she still believed it was temporary, still believed that she had the power to pull me back in whenever she wanted, still believed that I would break the moment she decided to change tactics. So I made my final move, the one thing she would never see coming, the thing that would finally make her understand exactly what she had done, exactly what she had lost, exactly how little control she had over me anymore. I sat down, took a deep breath, and started making the necessary changes, removing her as Liam's emergency contact, ensuring that she had no legal claim, no ability to interfere, no way to insert herself into my life again unless I allowed it. I reached out to Liam's daycare, to his doctors, to every institution that had her name on file as someone with any authority, and I erased it, wiped it clean, severed every last tie that connected her to us. And then, when I was done, when there was nothing left for her to cling to, I sent her the only message she would ever get from me again. Short, simple, final. I can't trust you. And I refuse to let my son grow up believing he is second place. I didn't wait for a response, didn't check to see if she had read it, didn't care whether she cried, whether she screamed, whether she spent the rest of her life trying to rewrite the story in her own favor. Because for the first time, I was in control, I was making the choices, I was deciding what kind of life I wanted for myself and for my son. And Diane, for the first time in her life, was about to understand what it meant to lose someone who had spent years trying to be enough for her. I had always believed that cutting someone out of your life would be this dramatic, painful process, filled with guilt, hesitation, second-guessing, and late-night tears over whether or not you had done the right thing. But as I sat in my kitchen, scrolling through the final list of changes I had made, each one another severed tie, another locked door, another reminder that my mother no longer had a place in my world, I felt none of that, only a strange, profound lightness, as if I had been carrying something so heavy for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. It had started with the legal steps, the necessary precautions, the small but significant moves that ensured Diane had no claim, no access, no possible way to interfere in my life again. I removed her name from every emergency contact list, from every form that had once given her even the illusion of authority, from every document that connected her to my son in any way that could be twisted, manipulated, or used against me. I updated Liam's daycare records, notified his doctor, called his school, made sure that if anything ever happened, she would be the last person they would turn to, the last person who could pretend she still had some semblance of control. And with every signature, every phone call, every confirmation email that landed in my inbox, I felt something inside me unravel, something tighten, something release in a way that felt irreversible, final, right. The hardest part wasn't the logistics, wasn't making the changes or dealing with the paperwork or ensuring that she had no way to insert herself back into my life. It was accepting, truly accepting, that I didn't need to justify any of it, that I didn't owe her an explanation, that I didn't have to sit down and lay out every reason why she had lost this privilege, why she had finally pushed me far enough that there was no coming back. She had spent years making decisions that put me second, that made me feel like I was something to be tolerated rather than cherished, something to be dismissed rather than considered, something to be used when convenient and discarded when I became too much. And now, for the first time, I was the one making the decision, and I wasn't going to explain myself to someone who had never once tried to explain why I was never enough for her. But of course, she found out. I wasn't sure how long it took before she realized what I had done, whether she had tried to list herself as an emergency contact somewhere and been denied, whether she had casually mentioned to someone that she still had some kind of say in Liam's life only to be corrected, whether Emily, who had started growing quieter every time we spoke, as if she was beginning to sense that this time was different, had said something that finally tipped her off. But when the call finally came, I wasn't surprised, wasn't shaken, wasn't even remotely tempted to ignore it. I wanted to hear it, wanted to hear the moment it hit her, wanted to hear the desperation in her voice as she realized, for the first time, that she had lost me in a way she could never undo. The phone rang twice before I answered, lifting it to my ear with the same slow, deliberate motion I had once used when preparing for a fight I knew I was going to win. "Sarah," she snapped, her voice sharp, breathless, as if she had been holding in the rage until the moment I picked up. "What the hell is this? I just found out you took me off everything, off Liam's school forms, off the emergency contacts, off everything. What are you thinking? Do you have any idea how hurtful this is?" I exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch, letting her sit in the weight of her own words, letting her realize that for once, she wasn't in control of this conversation, that there was nothing she could say that would make me scramble to fix things, to soothe her, to make it better. "I'm thinking," I said, my voice calm, measured, devoid of the anger I knew she was expecting, "that I can't trust you. And I refuse to let my son grow up thinking he's second place." For the first time in my life, I heard it, her breath hitching, the tiniest crack in her voice, the sharp, unmistakable sound of panic slipping through the cracks of her carefully constructed composure. "Sarah," she started, softer now, her tone shifting the way it always did when she realized anger wasn't going to work, when she had to switch tactics, when she had to try to sound like she cared. "You're overreacting. I was just helping Emily. It wasn't." I shook my head, cutting her off before she could finish, before she could twist the story into something smaller, something more manageable, something that placed the blame back on me. "I'm not doing this," I said, firm, unwavering, absolute. "I'm not explaining it to you. I'm not convincing you. I'm not giving you another chance to tell me I'm being dramatic. You did this. You chose this. And now I'm done." The silence that followed was long and heavy, the kind of silence that held all the words neither of us would ever say, the kind of silence that had been waiting to happen for years, the kind of silence that finally told me that this time, there was no going back. Her voice was tight when she spoke again, clipped, brittle, barely holding together the last fraying pieces of the control she had once had over me. "So that's it then?" she asked, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land, didn't quite sound like her usual brand of indifference. "You're just going to walk away from your own mother?" I smiled to myself, a small, knowing smile that she couldn't see, but that I felt deep in my bones, a smile that carried every ounce of freedom I had been waiting for. "I already did," I said, and then, without another word, I ended the call. And for the first time, Diane was the one being left behind. Months had passed since I had last spoken to my mother, months since I had severed every last tie between us, months since I had allowed her voice to be something that occupied space in my world. In that time, I had learned what it meant to live without the weight of her expectations pressing down on my shoulders, without the constant, exhausting struggle of trying to be good enough for someone who had never truly seen me, without the quiet, underlying ache of knowing that I would never be her priority. I had flourished in ways I hadn't even known were possible, found a kind of peace I had never experienced before, built a life that was mine and mine alone, one that didn't revolve around earning love from someone who had made it clear, time and time again, that I would never be her first choice. Liam thrived in the absence of her presence, no longer subjected to the passive favoritism, no longer treated like a footnote in a story that wasn't about him, no longer growing up under the unspoken lesson that some people's needs mattered more than others. I watched him laugh more, sleep more soundly, run into my arms at the end of the day without the shadow of confusion behind his eyes, and I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I had done the right thing. That I had finally broken the cycle before it could wrap around him the way it had wrapped around me. And for the first time, I felt free, not just from my mother, not just from Emily, but from the part of me that had always been waiting for them to change. Then, out of nowhere, the message came, sitting in my inbox like a relic from another life, simple and carefully worded, designed to sound gentle, designed to sound reasonable, designed to make me second-guess every decision I had made. "Sarah, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I miss you. I know things got tense between us and I don't want to fight anymore. I just want to talk. Maybe we can start fresh. Let me know if you'd be willing to meet." I stared at the words for a long time, letting them sink in, letting them sit heavy on my chest, waiting to see if they would stir something inside me, waiting to see if there was even a small part of me that still longed for the connection, still hoped that maybe, just maybe, she had changed. But all I felt was exhaustion, not the kind that comes from sadness or regret, but the kind that comes from finally knowing better, from finally understanding that some people will never give you what you need, from finally realizing that some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. And yet I agreed to meet her. Not because I believed her, not because I wanted to start fresh, not because I thought anything she said would undo the past. I agreed to meet her because I wanted to be the one to end it, to close the door myself, to make sure that when I walked away this time, it would be for good. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, neutral ground, a place that didn't hold any memories, a place where I could sit across from her without feeling the weight of our history pressing down on me. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her expression carefully composed, carefully curated to look warm, to look regretful, to look like a mother who had spent months missing her daughter instead of months resenting the fact that she had lost control over her. "Sarah," she said the moment I sat down, her voice soft, her smile small, the picture of a woman trying to make things right. "I'm so glad you came." I nodded but didn't smile, didn't soften, didn't give her anything to hold on to. "You wanted to talk," I said simply, my voice even, my hands steady, my heart unaffected in a way that would have been impossible a year ago. "So talk." She exhaled, as if she were relieved, as if she had expected me to be harder, colder, as if she thought this was the beginning of something rather than the end. I don't want to keep going like this," she said, reaching across the table slightly, as if she thought I would take her hand, as if she thought this conversation was heading toward reconciliation. "I miss you, Sarah. I hate how things ended between us. I know I made mistakes, but I don't want to lose you over one misunderstanding." I tilted my head slightly, studying her, watching the way she said the words so carefully, as if she had rehearsed them, as if she believed them, as if she genuinely thought that all of this could be undone with a simple admission of regret. "One misunderstanding," I repeated slowly, my voice carrying no malice, no anger, just quiet disbelief at how little she still understood. She sighed, as if she had expected me to be difficult, as if she was already preparing for the next step in her routine, already shifting gears toward guilt, toward obligation, toward whatever tactic she thought might work next. "You've always been so stubborn," she said, shaking her head with a small, rueful smile, the same one she had used on me since I was a child. "I know you were upset, but I did what I thought was best in the moment." "I thought you'd understand, Sarah." I held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence, watching as her eyes widened slightly, as she registered, finally, that I wasn't here to forgive, that I wasn't here to negotiate, that I wasn't here to let her reshape the truth into something more palatable. "You made your choice, Mom," I said, my voice calm, steady, final. "And now I've made mine. I hope Emily was worth it." I watched the words hit her, watched the realization sink in, watched as her lips parted slightly, as the color drained just a little from her face, as the panic flickered behind her eyes when she understood, really understood, that this was not a fight she could win. I stood up, slowly, deliberately, pushing my chair back without a second glance, without hesitation, without any of the lingering pain that had always made me stay just a little longer, try just a little harder, hope just a little more. And without waiting for her to respond, without giving her the chance to argue, to plead, to twist my words into something she could control, I turned and walked away, stepping out into the cool evening air, letting the door swing shut behind me like the final chapter in a book I was never meant to finish. And just like that, I was finally free.